Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Master Series, your guide to intelligent production, brought to you by Entertainment Partners. I'm your host, Natalie Nelson. In the Master Series, we focus on important issues impacting the entertainment industry and its workers through in-depth discussions with legal, tax, payroll, technology, and production experts. And today, our experts will be unlocking the myths and the benefits of co-production and how to confidently navigate your next international project. A few quick housekeeping items as we get started today. First, we encourage you to join the conversation by posting questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom call. You can do so by clicking the Q&A icon in the navigation menu, and we'll do our best to save time after today's discussion to answer questions. Also, please take a few seconds to answer a short feedback survey after today's webinar. This includes an opportunity for you to give us feedback, as well as suggest topics for future webinars. Your feedback is very important to us, and we thank you for it. For over 46 years, Entertainment Partners has been at the forefront of the industry, continually investing to ensure that our clients and their productions are successful, no matter where they're headed. As a global leader in entertainment payroll, production finance, and production management solutions, our integrated cloud-based digital solutions support every phase of production, and our established and growing teams in the US, Canada, UK, and Australia specialize in payroll, technology, incentives, tax, and accounting services. And our incentives experts, some of whom you will hear from today, offer decades of experience and the best guidance in the industry. I'm very pleased to introduce you to our panel. Today we are joined by executive producer Alex Boden, an award-winning film and television producer specializing in international production and co-production. Alex has extensive experience working with countries including the US, Germany, Italy, and Japan. His recent credits include 2 seasons of Max crime drama series Tokyo Vice, the Netflix fantasy adventure series Cursed, the grand-scale fantasy epic Cloud Atlas, starring Tom Hanks and Halle Berry, and the groundbreaking Netflix series Sense8, created by the Wachowskis and Tom Tykwer, which filmed in 17 cities globally, and for which he was nominated for a PGA award. Additionally, he is a board member and former chair of the Production Guild of Great Britain, a voting member of BAFTA, the European Film Academy, and the Producers Guild of America, and he is a member of the German-French Film Academy. We are also pleased to welcome Lloyd Gunton, director at FLB Accountants and Entertainment Partners Company. Lloyd has over 13 years of experience in accounting practice, training at Ernst & Young in its media audit division before moving to Safry Chapness to specialize in the creative sector tax credits. Lloyd has worked with productions ranging from micro-budget independent films to some of the biggest Hollywood blockbusters and high-end television shows. He joined FLB Accountants in 2023 and heads up the creative sector tax relief offering. We're also pleased to welcome Sarah Westman-Liu, Director of Tax Incentives and Products here at Entertainment Partners, where she provides tax credit administration and consulting services for Canadian and U.S. productions. Sarah also manages development of technology products used by productions to support their tax incentives and has over 20 years of production accounting, payroll, budgeting, and tax credit administration experience. And finally, today's guest moderator is Joe Chianese, Senior Vice President and Production Incentives Practice Leader here at Entertainment Partners. In his role, Joe provides production and legislative consulting, financial, tax, and administrative services for domestic and international production incentives. He has over 35 years of accounting, government affairs, production incentives, and tax experience, and has formerly held positions at Sony Pictures, the Walt Disney Company, ABC Television Network, Paramount Pictures, and Ernst & Young. Hello, panelists, and thank you for joining us today. It is a lovely day, and it is lovely to see all of you.
Thank you, Natalie. Yes,
I know that we get a lot of questions about co-production, so you have a lot of ground to cover, so I'll pass it over to you. Get us started.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, welcome everybody. So we've got past COVID, we've got past 2 strikes. Everyone in the industry is just really interested in getting back on track and producing great content while managing costs and other resources. Incentives are a big part of that, and we're going to touch on those today. And if you haven't subscribed to the EP incentive newsletter, I suggest you do that. It'll give you all the latest updates on domestic and international incentives. And also, you should go to ep.com if you're looking just to get any sort of summaries on domestic and international incentives as well. So yeah, so film and TV production is very expensive. And so it can be difficult to find the funding and resources necessary to put a film or TV project together. And this is where co-productions come in. And we're going to do our best today to demystify that word, because I've been in the industry 40 years and that word comes up a lot. And I think a lot of times people don't really understand the different types of co-productions that are out there. And we're going to do our best to sort of talk about that, as well as talk about the best practices and things you need to know, like vetting a co-producer and things like that. So we don't have a lot of time. We have about an hour, and we're going to primarily focus on, as I said, the different types of production and co-productions. And then we're also going to focus a bit more on the UK and Canada, and we'll touch on Australia a bit. And as we've been saying amongst ourselves here, the panelists, this is a really dense and important topic, so we may need to push to a part two if necessary. So we'll see where that goes. So with that said, I want to sort of kick things off with Alex and maybe ask him to sort of just start off with telling us what the different types of co-productions that are out there, and maybe just let's start demystifying what that word actually means.
Great, thank you, Joe, and hello to you all. To start us off, and I'd like to add that almost every production I've worked on in recent years has been a co-production of some kind. So what are the different types of co-production? Essentially, we're talking about a joint venture between two or more production companies. And it's really important to know that there are several different kinds of co-productions. You choose the one that's best for your project. So a co-production can be national, when production companies from the same country work together, partner up, or international, when you've got producers from two or more countries collaborating. And we're going to go into much more detail on both of these different options. But there's also, and this is something I've used a lot in recent years, the kind of co-production where you have a production service agreement between two related or unrelated parties. For example, a US producer working with a production service company in Hungary or the Czech Republic, with a fee paid to the production service company that's based on the level of their production services.
And that's probably, I won't say the most common type of co-production, but those are the ones that here in the US we see most, and we'll touch on this a bit more later as well. But the US is, I think, maybe the only country that does not have any co-production treaties with other countries. And so you highlighted to me, Alex, hasn't really been a disadvantage thus far because of the production service agreements. I don't know if you want to touch on that a bit more.
That's exactly right, because the production service agreement essentially gives you quite a lot of flexibility. It may not give you access to certain soft monies that are available in the country, which are only available under a co-production treaty. But what it does give you is as long as you qualify, as the film qualifies as a national film, for example, in the UK, we can very happily work with the US under a production service agreement, a PSA, and that gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of where we spend our money, how we spend it, who we spend it on, and so on. And it's been working very well for us across most of our productions recently, actually.
And again, something we're going to really dive in a bit further, but the thought is, damn, should I have done a co-production? And we're really, there are times where it doesn't make sense, and we're going to highlight when that might be. So Sarah, maybe you could just touch on just some of the initial benefits of a co-production.
Sure. Yeah. So if we're talking about an official treaty co-production in this case, obviously, first and foremost, one of the benefits is being able to access additional funding. So obviously we can you're accessing additional sources of talent and other resources as well. But of course, financing is a big part of it. And like we said, with the official co-productions, they're going to qualify as a national production in their own countries, which is probably going to entitle them to be eligible for higher incentive rates and other soft money subsidies and such that the government offers. It also opens up a wider distribution market for these productions. There's going to be at least, two local audiences, and probably even broader than that. It helps producers to spread the risk by pooling, creative and technical and financial resources. Co-productions can also result in more culturally relevant programming, which is, of course, a big thing that we're seeing more and more now, especially, in Europe, where there's now the 30% European quota requirement for streamers. So obviously local and culturally relevant programming is a big deal. And I think also because they're governed by a legal agreement, there's actually an established process in place, which helps to navigate what can be a very complicated process of these doing co-productions. So I think those are all some of the benefits. That said, I don't think anyone should just jump into a co-production lightly. There should be an organic reason for doing a co-production. Maybe it's the story or the setting or the characters takes place in two locations, or there's an established relationship, a collaborative partnership and trust between two companies that want to work together. Because as much as there are, financial benefits and otherwise, having two countries involved means, two sets of lawyers, two sets of accountants, two sets of regulators. There's a lot of administration. And so while there will be financial benefits, there's going to be additional costs as well.
Right. And maybe since we're talking about Canada right now, maybe you just highlight the Canadian incentive, both the federal and the provincial. And I know there's different types. So I know there's the Canadian content type incentive, which most U.S. producers don't do. But if you're in the midst of a co-production, chances are you might be able to utilize that higher federal percentage. So maybe you can just share
That's
that.
right. Yeah. So in Canada, we have two distinct tax credit programs. We have the Production Services Tax Credit Program and the Canadian Content. So like Alex alluded to, there's lots of production service work going on, and those productions are also accessing great tax credits as well. The Canadian Content tax credits are designed for our domestic productions, so national productions. They are higher rates. And obviously, if it is an official co-production, that would be the one time you would be able to qualify for those credits without it being an entirely Canadian production, because the Canadian portion of the co-production would qualify for the higher Canadian content rates. There's going to be an extra step in certifying if it's a co-production. So in addition to certifying with the tax credit regulators, you're also going to have to certify the production as an official treaty co-production with Telefilm. So there's an extra step there. All of the co-production treaties, they stipulate a minimum financial participation, which is typically something in the range of 15 to 30%. So that's going to have to be met. And then in addition to that, everything, whatever that split ends up being, if it's, 40, 60 or whatever, the rule of thumb is that all the elements of the production should fall in line with that. So the production is qualifying for Canadian content tax credits. It doesn't follow all the Canadian content rules, but it certainly has to follow the Telefilm. They have what they call a creative evaluation grid, where they determine that level of financial participation that the Canadian co-producer has, everything else falls in line with that. So the split of revenue share, intellectual property rights, sharing of the copyright, every production expenditures, everything else needs to fall in line with that level of financial participation.
Right. And as I was saying before with Alex, so the U.S. doesn't have any co-production treaties. So if you're a U.S. producer interested in doing a co-production, and I've seen this done before, you may go to Canada and do it through Canada. So can you explain, if you were a U.S. producer, how you would do that? I know that there are a lot of requirements, including moving the copyright, I believe, in terms of doing it that way. So can you sort of walk us through that, how that might work?
For a U.S. producer to do a co-production with Canada?
Yes, if they want it, so the IP starts in the U.S.
Right. Okay.
For whatever reason, yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, in that case, like you mentioned, U.S. and Canada do not have a co-production treaty, so it would not be able to qualify as an official treaty co-production. And there's also other situations where a Canadian company could be partnering with, like doing a production with France, for instance, where they do have a co-production treaty, but there's some element of the production, maybe they have a U.S. screenwriter involved. So that's going to put it offside of qualifying as a treaty co-production. So in a case where you have a co-production going on that cannot qualify as an official treaty co-production, we do have another structure that would be available in this case, which is called the CRTC co-venture. So this is a bit of a hybrid model where the production has to follow a lot of the same Canadian content rules, but it's not going to qualify for Canadian content tax credits. It's going to still qualify for production services tax credits. Yep. However, it can be certified with CRTC, which is our broadcaster regulator, it will get a special recognition number, and it will qualify as Canadian content for broadcast purposes. So just going back to that idea of quotas, in Canada, we have broadcaster quotas, and we actually have new legislation that was just brought in, Bill C-11, which is extending this to streamers as well, where there are quota requirements to broadcast a certain amount of Canadian content. So although these CRTC co-venture productions don't qualify for Canadian as Canadian content for tax credit purposes, they qualify as Canadian content for broadcast purposes, which means it helps meet those quotas and can potentially command a higher broadcast fee and stuff like that. So there are definitely advantages to that. So an example with the one type of show where this really works well is like, say, a format show. So it's not going, because there's no requirement for the Canadian company to own the copyright. So it can come up here and be an entirely Canadian production, but the copyright is owned and it's split 50-50, and the production is split 50-50 with this US co-producer, and that could qualify as a co-venture. So that's one example of a show where we see that that's a good fit for that model. It's not a commonly used model, but again, with new legislation and Bill C-11, there is a lot of renewed interest in it. So I think we are going to see a kind of a return to these co-ventures. And then short of that, if the co-ventures, it's too many hurdles to jump through, then you just come up here and do a PSA, like Alex said, just do a production service agreement with the Canadian producer, and you still get great tax credits anyway. And it's a lot easier, a lot of less hoops to jump through. So That's another option.
Thanks, Sarah. So Lloyd, I don't want you to think we forgot about you. So without doing a deep dive on the UK co-production jet, maybe just talk about how a co-production might make it easier for a filmmaker to access the UK incentive.
Sure. So in terms of unofficial co-production, so using production service agreement, that is how you access it. You have to be a UK company, an American company, Canadian company, French company, can't access the general incentive. But looking at more at the official co-productions, you are able to access the tax credit without having to go through the cultural test. So in a scenario where you might have a show that's got some British elements but not enough to pass the cultural test, if it's a co-production with another country, that enables you to actually access the tax credit without the cultural test. As Sarah rightly says, there are all sorts of quotas and requirements going right down to the number of people involved and their nationalities, and this all got to be broadly in line with the overall breakdown of the show and the financial contributions. But it's an alternative route. So there are two routes, but it comes to the same incentive. You don't get an additional or varying rate on that. And as Alex said earlier, there are lots of other regional rate incentives here in grant form that can help access it. And co-productions very often access those as well. I see probably a high proportion of the official co-productions I work on access regional funding compared to the standard commissioning agreement PSA arrangement.
Great. So we've been using the word official co-production versus unofficial, and I would say, to keep things simple, let's say an unofficial co-production would be a sort of a PSA type arrangement. Maybe you can to tell everyone what an official co-production is. And again, even though you'll be talking about it from a UK perspective, it's relatively the same in every country that has these type of agreements.
Absolutely. So an official co-production is where you are independent. You've got two producers from the different countries and they sign a co-production agreement to jointly produce it. So the co-production agreement will set out who's responsible for what elements. So it might be that all the shoots being done in the UK, but all of VFX is being done in Canada. I worked on one a number of years ago where there was shoot in Brazil, shoot in the UK, and post in Canada. It was a tripartite co-production. There was lots of forms to fill in for it, but it worked brilliantly. They were able to access tax credit all the way, and it was a genuine collaboration between the producers from the different areas. In the UK, you need to be certified a minimum of 2 weeks before cameras start rolling, or have at least applied for it at least 2 weeks before cameras start rolling. To get your interim certificate of co-production, and then you get a final at the very end. As Sarah said and I alluded to a minute ago, you have to keep your proportions in line, which can be a risk if things change during production. And show me a production where things haven't changed. You do need to bear that in mind, but in that scenario, you can go back to the certifying authority, so Telefilm, the BFI over here, and speak to them about it and say, this has moved for these reasons. We had overruns in shoot, or something happened, or there was a story change, or whatever it may be. And they tend to want to work with you to help you come up with it. So Anna Mancy heads up the BFI certification unit here, and she is brilliant for anything like that, on how to help productions make sure that unexpected changes don't cause issues from an incentive pathway.
Right. Thanks, Lloyd. So, Alex, let's try to further demystify co-productions, and then maybe you can also talk about some of the productions you've done that utilize some co-production elements.
Absolutely. So, like I said, everything's been a co-pro of some kind. And then the question is, and most of them have been able to access national incentives as well as some regional incentives. But you always want to bear in mind what kind of a production do you have, because every production is different, and and how simple can you keep it, because it's very easy to create a structure that gets way too elaborate and way too complicated. And so you might already be thinking, this sounds like far too much work. It's complicated. It's not something I want to get involved in. Well, that's an important question to ask every time you approach a new project, because you have, on films, we see many, we can see 5, 6 different co-producing companies on a film at the moment. And and there's a question of, do you want to be in part of that way of working? It's very different from producing a film on your own. For myself, I speak French, I speak German. I've always been very open to international exchange that a co-production brings, I suppose. So most recently on Tokyo Vice, which it's a US project. It's set up by a US studio that has, very simply, just to describe the outline, has an LLC, which holds the IP, the copyright. The LLC has a license agreement with the network and also with a distributor, co-producer who came onto the project. But then we have PSAs, production service agreements, first of all with Japan, because the whole series is filmed pretty much in Japan, which covers all the local production, local cast, local crew, local studios, everything that takes place on the ground in Japan. But we also have, and this is something I do quite often, everything that's non-US and non-Japan, we have a PSA, a UK company which covers all of that. So it could be UK crew, it could be UK actors. So we have a separate PSA and a separate company structure in the UK for that. And then also, and this is common across most of the productions I work on, we have additional agreements, like Lloyd was saying, for VFX. So we have, in this case, Quebec for our VFX, and we might have some work in Ontario for production work. So again, PSAs, additional agreements to cover off both of those pieces of work. And what's good, I don't know if you can see here, but we have these agreements, these structures. I'll remind you of them again and again. These are gold. They're fun to do, and it makes something very complicated look much more straightforward. But they also show you how many parties are involved.
There's one of those on every single incentive claim I've done.
Yes.
Every single one.
And it's really it's very good to have them, because then you know where they all fit in. And on Sense8, that was particularly important, because we have a US LLC that it's partnered with Netflix, who financed the show, and we have a PSA. The US LLC has a PSA with our UK company, and the UK company had to have PSAs, production service agreements, in place with every single production company that we needed in all the different countries around the world, from Kenya to Mexico to Iceland to the Netherlands, to cover the 17 different cities that we filmed in across the 2 seasons and the films that we made for the show. Importantly, these PSAs were structured very carefully. They needed to allow the production to benefit from local incentives and rebates, to make sure that all of that finance could be reclaimed and could be passed back to the producers and to the network, but also to reclaim local VAT and tax. There are quite a few different points that it's really important to include in those PSAs and to cover up front. There's another on Cloud Atlas, which was a large-scale independently financed movie. All the filming was in Europe, so this is very much a European production, and with a large amount of soft money coming from almost every fund in Germany. It was very important that this was qualified as a German film. So we had a German director in Tom Tikva, German cast, German studios, locations, all of this and much more qualified the film as German and as European very comfortably. So at the heart of the structure, again, we had a GmbH, a German company, licensed the rights to produce the series from the US, PSAs, with an LLC to cover all the US production, the union cast, union crew hires, and then another PSA with the UK company for all the non-German and non-US cast on what was a very, very international production. We had people coming from all over the world to join us for filming in Europe. And then, again, agreements with the many different VFX companies on the film to access the rebates in Canada. We had lots of different VFX vendors across worldwide, the UK, Canada, US, and so on.
So, Lloyd, I wanted to ask you just to maybe highlight some of the benefits of a bilateral co-production, both the benefit for the country and the producer. But when you were talking about UK before, I don't know if you really got a chance to talk about the UK incentive and also some of the changes that have recently happened and some of the changes that might be happening.
Sure. So I think the key benefit is it's all about, Alex phrased it far better than I will, about exchange of ideas, cultural contribution, heritage, skill exchange, and all of that. So there's huge benefits from a country perspective, from a general economic perspective, and for the producers, it's getting experience of working with different people, working in different film cultures, different cultures in general, all of which is great and really helps you expand your network. And anyone who's worked in this industry any length of time knows that that's sort of vitally important. So that's part of it. I think from a UK incentive perspective, as I mentioned, all the rates are the same. It's 25% under the old regime, if you will, and going to be an effective 25.5% under the new incoming regime, the AVEC, which we've covered on other webinars and in other articles. But I think the thing to mention from a co-production standpoint is that the new AVEC isn't going to change that. It's going to be available at the same rate. It's going to be the same for co-productions, and the access is going to be the same. You're going to need to qualify as an official co-production, and then you're going to be eligible for it on your UK spend that you incur on that production.
Right. So, Sarah, I think we touched on this already, but I just think it's important to talk about it again. So when or why would you not do an official co-production?
So again, obviously, if you can't qualify because you're working with the US, and we see obviously the bulk of our production work in Canada is for US rights holders, studios or streamers or whoever. So all that work is production service work. So that's number one. Again, our production service tax credits are so easy to qualify for in Canada. And, it's just a really easy process. So, if you're just looking for ease of, I just want to get in and get great tax credits, that's your easiest route, number one. So I think that would be the reason that you wouldn't do it. If you could qualify for as a co-production, then yeah, you're going to get a little bit higher tax credits. So it's going to be worth probably those extra steps, but just knowing that there is extra requirements. And, I guess that the reason maybe would be, again, it goes back to ease and of accessibility and control and stuff like that. I think, when you are working, if you're accessing production service tax credits, you know what to expect, you know how to do it. It's a simple process. As soon as you get into a co-production, you're now relying as well on another country, another co-producer, and another country's regulators that you really have no control over. And it's funny, Lloyd mentioned a co-pro with Canada, UK, Brazil. I also worked on one that was the same tripartite, same companies, or countries, I should say. And we had an issue because in Canada, there are some final deadlines for your tax credits. And one of the requirements for your Part B is the telefilm final recommendation related to the co-production. And part of telefilm's process to issue that final recommendation is some sign-offs from the other party, their counterparts, the regulators in the other countries. And we were having, a difficult time with one of the other countries' regulators that just worked at a different speed. And we had no control over that process. And we got really, really close to the deadline of not being able to get what we needed from the other country in order to get what we needed from telefilm, in order to get what we needed to not miss our deadline on the tax credits. So, I think that's another valid thing to think about. Like Alex said, does this structure make sense? Is this something that you're comfortable with? And if you're feeling like there's a lot of elements that are going to be outside my control and I just want to know my tax rates, yeah, a little lower rate, but I know they're secure and I don't have to worry about it. I know I'm going to qualify for them and get them back in this certain time frame. That peace of mind may overrule like that little extra in tax credit amount that you would get in a co-production.
So Sarah, you mentioned Telefilm Canada. Can you explain to everyone what Telefilm is and how they sort of fit into the process?
Right. So Telefilm is the regulator of all those co-productions. Canada has co-production treaties with almost 60 countries now. So I think we're the world leader in that. We have a lot of agreements. So they manage that whole process, and they're the ones that you would need to certify as an official treaty co-production. They also can help you. They have they publish all the stats and the resources and all the all the history of all the co-productions and all the different producers that were involved. And so you can see on an annual basis, which our top two countries are UK and France. Those are the two biggest ones that we collaborate with. But, there's probably 50, 60 co-productions produced in Canada a year, and they're with all sorts of different countries. So you can get all that kind of information and stuff from Telefilm.
Great. And Lloyd, you mentioned BFI. Maybe you can explain to everybody who BFI is and how they sort of fit into the official co-production process in the UK.
Sure. So BFI is the British Film Institute, and mirroring sort of what Sarah said to a great degree, they're the ones who sign off on you being an official co-production. They're also the ones that sign off on qualifying as British film under the cultural test. They're responsible more broadly for the promotion of British film and TV and video games and all sorts. So they're a hugely valuable part of the creative sector industry over here. As Sarah mentioned, we do have a co-production treaty with Canada as well. I think there's 12 or 13 bilateral co-production treaties we have. We're also party to the European Convention on Cinematic Co-production, which clearly Canada isn't going to be able to be party of, unfortunately. The good thing about a lot of the bilateral agreements is that they often allow for a third-party producer. So you can have a UK-Canada agreement. The UK-Canada agreement allows for a third-party co-producer, which means that if Canada has got an agreement with a country that the UK doesn't, that agreement can be joined, if you will, with the UK one, so that you can have a three-party co-production, even though the UK doesn't have a direct agreement with them, which is brilliant because it opens up more avenues for people to collaborate and work together. It sounds like Sarah and I might have worked on the same production, actually, from the comments about that one. But you do need to bear in mind who you're working with and what it's like. I've had a similar experience with other bilateral co-productions where time has just not caused us to lose it, but caused a delay in getting the credit back. And the other thing I would say to watch for with official co-productions is common ownership of the companies. None of our bilateral treaties allow by default common ownership or control or management of the companies. They do need to be legally separate from each other. A couple of the treaties do allow it by exception, and a couple will allow it with agreement from both sides. So Telefilm and the BFI could both sign off on it, although I should say the UK-Canada treaty doesn't, just using the governing bodies as an example there. So that is one to watch in that they are designed to encourage collaboration and work between people, not within a larger group to try and just use this as a way to access different incentives.
Yeah, so I think a question a lot of people ask, and I know it's just popping into my head when I think about requirements, if I'm doing an official co-production, is there a certain minimum spend that I need to think about, minimum hiring? When does the cultural test apply? Does it apply in an official co-production?
Sure. So from a UK perspective, you've got to apply for your interim co-producting certificate at least 2 weeks before cameras start rolling. That is a hard deadline as well. And we'd always encourage you to be way earlier than that if you can possibly do it. I think Sarah mentioned earlier on that generally the minimum spend is somewhere between 15 and 30%, and that is treaty dependent. Once you've hit that, that's going to be your guiding figure going forward. So let's say we've got a 30-70 split. We'd be expecting across the entire production about 30% of the employees to be UK and about 70% to be Canadian. So that doesn't mean that in the UK you couldn't just hire a French editor because you needed that particular editor. That's okay. You are allowed to do that, but you can't then bring in loads of overseas workers or loads of foreign nationals to do it, because the idea is it's a co-production between the nations. So you've got to keep those ratios in line. They're never going to be exact, and the expectation is not that they're exact, but they do have to be guidelines. The expectation would also be that UK would sign UK distribution deals and bring in a proportion of UK finance. The Canadian company would bring in Canadian finance. And I believe I'm right in saying that you need a locked finance plan in place at the start as well. I think some jurisdictions are a little more lenient on that, but you do need to have it lined up rather than hoping to get more money in down the line.
So Lloyd, how is the process sort of approved at the very end? So we mentioned how you set things up and certain things you have to do to qualify. And at the very end, does BFI, who comes in and basically reviews everything? And what happens if you, at the end of the day, find out that you didn't meet those qualifications?
Hopefully you work with really good advisors that mean you don't end up in that situation. I'd like to say first off, the BFI will issue the final certificate. They will review the film, review a suite of documents that you've got to submit. And you'll also need an accountant's report on that application, which is a service that we at FLB can provide for the UK and Entertainment Partners can provide for Canada, where we would go through and go, okay, we'll look at the financial contributions and we'll check them and we'll use that ratio, and then we'll go through and we will review the entire credit list, nationality and residency, what proportion are we at. We'll be looking at who the money was spent with by the UK producer, who the money was spent with by the Canadian producer, testing that back to invoices and going cast as well, looking at the cast members. So it's quite a lot of detail, and much more detail generally than the cultural test. But if you're not going to pass the cultural test or you're not set up in that way, then yes, it's detail, yes, it's admin, yes, there's a fee. But if that fee is helping you get the incentive and the tax credit, then it's worth it.
So Sarah, is there anything you want to sort of add going back to the Canadian side in terms of the overall process, in terms of starting the process and at the end of the process?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Lloyd covered it. It pretty much mirrors our process. I guess the one difference is he said his application needs to be in 2 weeks prior to principal. In Canada, the telefilm application would need to be in 30 days prior to principal. So, one difference to be aware of. But yeah, overall, the requirements at the end, the cost audit, all that is fairly similar.
And that's what I wanted you to say. At the end of the day, I want everyone to know the process is relatively the same. At the end of the day, every production or every co-production is unique, but the process is going to be the same for everyone. Mm-hmm. So Alex, we promised everyone we were going to touch on Australia a little bit. I mean, we're not going to do a deep dive on co-production specifically, although I do know that Australia has co-productions with Canada, China, Germany, India, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Korea, Malaysia, Singapore, South Africa, and the UK. So they've got quite a few. So I know you had some thoughts about Australia. It would be really great for you to share that with the audience.
Yeah, exactly. I'm excited about where this could go, because Australia is really, they've had a really good last few years. We're one of the few places we could film in globally during COVID. Australia they have excellent crews. They have bankable cast. They have great facilities, and they've really been improving in recent years. And the offset has just rocketed up from 16.5%, I think it is, to 30%. So this is all, things are moving in the right direction for Australia as a co-production country. State incentives are strong and they're very supportive as well. So Queensland, Victoria, and Northern Territory, there's a lot of, the goal is to make sure that production is really continues to grow in Australia. So very interesting. And obviously English language helps as well. It's just the distance and the time difference and the various things that you obviously have to factor in when you're doing a co-production, and how additional factors like travel and travel costs and everything will work for you on your production.
Right. So I'm going to stick with you, Alex, because the thing we also talked about when we were prepping for this is the importance of determining a co-production partner. So maybe you might want to sort of walk through your process or the process in general.
It's this is almost saving the best for last, because this is the this is the sort of crucial thing. Exactly. How do we first of all just the bigger picture in terms of what the locations, what the location will give for your production, what the cast and crew will be able to provide, what services and people are available in the country that you're considering. Tax, financial as much as creative. I think the two considerations always go hand in hand. And I just mentioned language. I think it's really, are you going to be able to communicate? Does your story naturally fit for that other country? Are there any cultural or historic connections that will work in favor of that production? the way people produce varies a lot from country to country. It's surprising how different the way of making a film or a TV series can be in different places around the world. So that's something to also bear in mind, just to make sure that you're clear on how any differences that exist, and then logistics, really, especially at the moment. Are visas easy to arrange? Can you get your people and your equipment across the borders when you need them? Can you get your funding to the right place? Are there any issues with the country that you're considering? Lots of different things to consider even before you start to find your actual co-production partner, and that's a separate project.
Great. Lloyd, I wanted to go back to you again and just sort of highlight for everyone the multiple benefits that would come to a filmmaker doing an official co-production. Just sort of really want to roll that out again. Because again, in my head, I still see everything sort of leaning more toward a PSA type arrangement. And I just want everyone to see when and why they would do an official co-production.
Yeah, I think it's the ability to pool financial resources from several countries. So if you've got a UK producer that's got great access to a pre-sales agent, let's say, and they trust them, but that's not going to do the whole film. And you might have the same in Canada or something like that. Doing it as a co-production can make it easier to get those funds in and accessible for the entire film to use. And I mean, you said about Canadian production quotas, it's something that's a bit of a hot topic around the globe. And I think it's probably something that we're going to see more and more of. Yep. It can be access to incentives as well, just in terms of there can in other jurisdictions be co-pro only incentives. It's not what we have in the UK, but that's not to say that as an official co-production that you might not be better off doing it that way rather than under PSA, because you can get a better rate in, say, Belgium. And it's, I think the other thing, a lot of it is kind of it's the soft elements of production, ironically coming from the tax incentive accountant, but the whether it's access to talent, access to markets, locations, the ability to learn from your production partners. Alex saying there how different the approach can be. So there can be a huge amount to learn from them and develop for future projects and just generally networking. So there can be real tangible benefits to it.
So knowing that you've got the co-producers in place who are involved in the production very early on, working closely with their sales agent, with their distributors in that country, you're also hopefully going to see a much better release and a much more success for the production. That's a big hook for us as well.
Exactly. Yeah, you can get, if you've got two sales agents that are invested from domestic purposes rather than one who is, say, a UK primary sales agent, that's double the firepower potentially you've got, and just the natural desire to do more for their own production, if you will. I can see Alex nodding away enthusiastically there.
I'm kind of curious if anyone knows the answer to this. It just popped into my head. If you're doing a co-production with China, does that, going back to the potential distribution benefit, does doing a co-production with China give you a guaranteed distribution in China? Because I know there's a lot of limitations as to what gets released in China. Does anyone know that?
I worked on one of the very first UK-China co-productions, which did get a release in China. I can't say whether it gets you a guaranteed release because I believe it still has to go through the, I forget the official name, the Chinese co-producer referred to it as the censorship board, but I don't think that's its official name any longer. Right. So I think it gives you a fast track to a release more so than just a standard production that you take to try and distribute in China, because they're going to have some form of distribution lined up probably as part of the finance plan. That was a great example, actually, of something Alex mentioned about communication and language. The Chinese production partner in this instance, at first they were brilliant. They had two or three people in their team that spoke excellent English, and there was no problem with communication whatsoever. However, they left the production company in China, and their replacements didn't have the same proficiency in English, and it caused a significant challenges in terms of just not difficulty, no one trying to do things to upset their partners or anything like that, but simply in terms of communicating, it did make it different. So that is definitely something to consider. Although luckily we did have a production accountant in the UK who was completely fluent in Hokkien, and that made our lives a lot easier.
Fantastic. So we've been talking about the benefits. Maybe you could share, and I'll stay with you, Lloyd. So potential negatives or cons of an official co-production.
So there are two really. The first is the admin side. There's no two ways around it. There's more on the admin side. You've got to keep on top of it through productions. There's an admin burden. You've got to track it, and therefore the fees associated to the application process are higher. And the general fees you would incur for accounts and tax submission don't really change. So it stays much the same anywhere. So there's that element. The other is what's sort of colloquially referred to as the co-pro tax in the UK, which is a quirk of the way the UK incentive is structured, in that you cap out in the UK at 80% of your total spend. So once your UK proportion goes above 80, you're getting tax credit on 80% of total. Mm-hmm. Well, with a unofficial co-pro, you look at the worldwide spend, because due to the nature of UK structure, that all comes into the UK company. So you look at the worldwide spend. So in our 40-60 split we mentioned earlier, you'd get 25% of the 40. So you'd be getting an effective 10% rate there. However, when you're looking at an official co-pro, only the UK costs sit in the UK company. So suddenly we're looking at a 40. Well, that's 100% of what we're looking at. So we're capped at 80 now. So now we're going to get 25% of 32. So we're going to get 8 back in that scenario. So it's the co-pro tax. So you do get a little bit less there. That said, if you're not going to pass the cultural test, better 8 than 0. So it's certainly not a death knell or anything like that. And the success of UK official co-productions would support that entirely. But it is something to bear in mind, that you do end up with a little bit of a grind on the tax credit in the UK.
Right. Sarah, any cons on your side in Canada that you can think of that you might want to share with everyone?
No, I don't think so. I agree with Lloyd. It's the extra administration. It's the extra steps. But again, you are accessing higher tax credits, so that may net out to be worthwhile overall. But yeah, it's just, you just don't want to go in not budgeting for that and not contemplating ahead of time that there are going to be extra administrative costs involved.
If I can just add one thing onto that,
sure.
In terms of for people considering doing it, when you consider whether it's worth it or not with the additional, so you might have additional costs and things like that, don't forget the cost of your own time as a producer, because it's all well and good looking at my accountant's going to charge me this bit more, my lawyer's going to charge me this bit more, but I'm going to get this much of extra tax credit. Okay, great. If that's in the black, that's a good start. But what's your time worth? How much time are you or your team going to have to put in? And is that going to detract from what you're able to do? And I've seen people make the decision before and go, oh, it's worth it. It's an extra £10,000. And then you come back 3 years later and you go, I think you've spent £10,000 of your time on this that you didn't need to. So just a friendly tip for anyone considering that to value themselves as much as anything.
Right. So I want to, before we go to audience Q&A, I want to sort of have Sarah and Alex tag team on this last point, and Lloyd, please jump in. But again, just highlighting best practices, things, can you justify doing an official co-production? Does your project actually need it? So Alex, maybe you can start off with some of the best practices and tips you can share with the audience.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've already made it clear. Planning is everything. You're basically going to have to do a lot of work to determine whether this is going to be the right way forwards for your project or not. Can the budget support it? Does the schedule work for a co-production? I really do recommend work with good lawyers. Make sure they have co-production experience, not just good lawyers who are good domestically. Work with accountants who've got, again, with co-production experience, and financial advisors as early as possible. So get those early opinions in. Will this even work as a general idea before you start to factor in the nationalities of your directors, your talent, and the locations of your script, that kind of thing. And And the rules do change a lot, don't they? Incentives can change, go up and down, or disappear. New ones are introduced, so you have to keep track, and that's where your partners, your producer friends, accountants, lawyers can also be helpful. So if you're finding all of that out early, then really case by case, work out what what kind of a producer you want to work with, really. Doing your due diligence is the most important thing. You're going to be working together for 2 years at least, I would say, if not 3, 5, or even more years, because you're dealing with the exploitation of projects. So you have to find the right partner.
Yeah, I agree. I think it really comes down to the relationship. It's not just a transactional relationship, like when you're engaging a service producer for a PSA project. This is, you're co-producing this. There has to be a collaboration and a trust, and hopefully some experience maybe working together in the past. So I think it really comes down to that first. You don't want to just be doing this for incentives, for instance. That's not a good enough reason. And then I think also, like Alex said, it's also you're now into another jurisdiction. If it's an unfamiliar jurisdiction and you haven't worked there before and you don't know maybe the stability of their incentive program or how their regulators work or something like that, you do need to do your due diligence on that as well. Like ask around, ask other producers who've had experience working in that jurisdiction. Like, how did it go? How was the process? Like, was it smooth? Did they, because there's lots of unknowns when you're suddenly in a different jurisdiction, and that stuff's out of your control again. So it's not a great feeling when you're relying on some regulator in some other country to issue some document and you really can't control that. So again, I would do a lot of research. I would talk to people who worked there before and just make sure that you're comfortable before you jump into that situation.
Definitely.
Just to tag on to what Alex said about doing it early, this is a comment that will make more sense to our UK audience. So Martin Lewis, money savings expert, his thing about holiday insurance is ASAB, as soon as you book. And I think you apply that here as soon as you prep, or before that, as soon as you're developing, that's when you should start taking a step back and going, right, I need to have this in place for accountants, lawyers, things like that. Have I got it right? Because it's going to be cheaper to do it right once and not have to try and retrofit things or figure out what we should have done when and things like that. So as soon as you can on any sorts of advice you want and who you're working with, and check.
Yes. And co-producing is a skill. I mean, you're putting together a really complex finance plan, and that's something that needs to be learned, really. And this is worth mentioning, I think, that many producers have been spoiled by the streamer and TV boom recently. They may not have that experience. So what you're doing is you're looking at your potential co-producer partners' work, their team. Are they experienced? What kind of experience do they have? Do they work on the same kind of projects as you're looking to make and do make? And are you going to be able to get someone who really believes in your project and gets it? That's I will, whenever I go to another country, or I will always speak to as many producers as possible and partners about who have worked in that country or with that region, and get their recommendations and input, because information is everything when you're going into somewhere, especially when you're going into a new territory where no one has maybe produced before, working with a new treaty, something that has to be tried out. That you might be I've been the guinea pig on a couple of treaties, and that's always been interesting.
That's great. I think this is a perfect segue to the audience Q&A. We got so many early questions submitted. I'm sure we got a ton more. So I'm going to jump to Natalie and see if she can throw some questions at us.
Sure. Thank you. Yes, a lot of questions coming in. And if we don't cover your question, because we are coming up to the hour marker, we'll definitely be reaching out to you to clear up any questions. So you can expect an email from us, and we'll also share contact information for everyone in case you'd like to get in touch. So Alex, I'm going to start with you. And we got a question. What is the most efficient way that you have found to manage multiple locations within one production? You have a lot of experience with this, so give us your take. What is the best practice there?
I mean, you absolutely have to have ground control. You have to manage centrally. You have to, and hopefully have the budget and the schedule to support that. But you have to have a team in the center of all of this, and above on the chart that I flashed up earlier, who has the overview of how everything fits together, so that making sure that the production gets what it needs, but also making sure at the same time that all the locations are getting what they need to be able to deliver their portion of the production. Again, good accountants and lawyers locally as well as for you at the center to set all of this up. And you'll probably want to have good production management and accounting crew, bilingual if possible. I like the sound of that to go and work with the local teams. Really important to have the best possible local crew with the best possible producer or line producer on the ground, so that everything is ready and prepped when the director and cast arrive.
All right, wonderful. Lloyd, I'm going to go over to you now, and this is a compilation of quite a few questions that we've received today. How important is it to make that clear distinction between co-producer and a service production agreement with an underlying treaty?
Okay, so vital is the short version, because they are separate channels and they are mutually exclusive channels. So vital. But what I would say is Alex mentioned about getting a good lawyer who knows what they're doing with it is vital, because because you call yourself co-producers doesn't mean you can't do it under production services agreement with the correct setup. However, if you have divvied up responsibilities at the wrong level, you are going to be unable to qualify in the UK for the normal incentive. And if you have then not applied for as a official co-production and you're not doing it under treaty, then you're not going to get that incentive either. So it's a really important thing to establish early on: is this an official co-production, or are you doing this under a production services arrangement? They are different setups and have different requirements. So that's really, really quite important.
All right, great. Alex, I have a question for you. We've gotten quite a few people asking about the chart. When does the chart come into play? How do you get the chart? Is there a template for the chart?
That's great. I mean, this is an omnigram. This is a very straightforward document. That nothing, not film specific at all. If you look up corporate structure charts or omnigrams, you'll find plenty of software that's easy to access, or you can do it in Microsoft Word and so on as well. But think of it as a doodle. You can do it by hand. You can start to basically say, okay, here's my company. Here's maybe my co-producer, and you start to fit it all together in terms of where all the companies and structures, organizations, public funders, incentives fit into that diagram. And it's really good to map out. We talked earlier about mapping out the way the production will run way before you even sign a contract to actually do the production, just to make sure that what you have in mind is going to work. And by the way, this in the way that you have something on paper, you can show it to your lawyers, you can show it to your accountants, who will probably redline it and come up with something hopefully even better for the right people.
I was just going to say, Alex, in the scenario where you and I were having a first conversation about a production, I'd be sat on my end of a Zoom call with a piece of paper, and I'd be drawing it, or actually I'd probably be sharing a screen and doing it on Excel, because that piece of paper is on every tax incentive file I've ever worked on, because it's so important. And it helps, going back to the question that was raised to me, it helps that as well. Because you look at it and you go, you're not going to be an official co-production like that. We do it as a PSA. Or actually, do you know what? This could work better that way for these reasons.
Yep.
Definitely. And very important for the rights management as well, the IP of the project at the heart of it.
All right. Thank you. This is going to be our last question, as I see we've just hit the hour mark. Sarah, I'm going to head over to you. We've got a few questions about setting up production company in Canada, the logistics. Is it necessary? Can you just give us a high-level overview and anything that our audience may need to know if they are looking to head to Canada and qualify there?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, that ties back perfectly to the chart, because one of those entities is obviously going to be the Canadian production company if it's part of the CoPro. And yeah, you definitely need it. You need a Canadian taxable corporation, because that's the tax-paying entity that's going to qualify, be the applicant for the tax credits, qualify for them, and then receive them as a refund back. So, yeah, you definitely need to set up probably a special purpose corporation that's set up just for that production, and that is going to be the co-production partner in this co-producing arrangement, the Canadian one. And it's simply setting up an incorporation and all the, administrative things that go along with that, a minute book and all that. But yeah, it's a very straightforward process of just basically incorporating a Canadian taxable corporation, but definitely required. You won't be accessing tax credits without it.
Thank you for making that clear. All right. Again, everyone, thank you for your answers to the questions. Thank you to our audience for all of the wonderful questions. And we'll get back to you if we didn't get your question live. So with that, I'm going to actually pull up some contact information about those questions. If you'd like to get in touch with any of our team for US productions, Canadian productions, UK productions, or Australia productions, you can do so. I'm going to leave this up here for a minute or so, but I'm also going to drop these into the chat so you can quickly copy and paste and save those for yourself. Then we're going to say thank you again and let people know that in addition to any of the information about co-production, if you'd like to learn more about incentives, the services that we offer, the wonderful tools on ep.com, our jurisdiction comparison tool, our incentives estimator, you can find information about tax credit and minimum guarantee financing, a lot of great work that Joe and the incentives team put into these tools, this information, and we would love to have you come visit us and learn more. And for everyone who's looking to catch the replay, because we covered so much, you can always go over to ep.com/master series. Our entire library of master series is there available for you. This is industry news. This is production incentives, financing, legislation. We cover so many topics. So please visit us. And we also will be sending a recording of today's session to everyone. So we advise you to keep an eye on your inbox for that. All right. Thank you again to everyone for attending and sticking with us. I know we went over our time. And thank you, panelists, for all of your insights and the wonderful information that you've shared with us today. We hope to have you back on a future panel. And audience, we hope to see you at a future Master Series.